There's one rule in combat sports that everyone agrees to before anything else happens. You pick a weight class, you agree to a number, and you hit it. That's the deal. No asterisks, no negotiations, no exceptions. And yet, some of the biggest names in the sport have stepped on that scale and found ways to make the number say whatever they needed it to say. Champions, contenders, prospects, all of them. And most of the time, nobody faced any real consequences at all. Weight cutting itself is already pushing the boundaries of what's fair. Fighters walk around at weights far above their division limit, drain their bodies down to make the number, then rehydrate and come back into the cage 10, 15, sometimes 20 pounds heavier than their opponent ever got to be at the official weigh-in. It's a system that rewards whoever can suffer the most in the days before the fight and punishes anyone who shows up honestly. As one fighter put it, it's sanctioned cheating that everybody has to do. So when the pressure is already that extreme, and the rewards for winning are that enormous, it probably shouldn't be surprising that some fighters decided to push it even further and find ways to cheat the scale itself. Khamzat Chimaev heading into UFC 328 was already in a bizarre situation before the weight cut even started. He had been scheduled to fight at light heavyweight, which meant he had been bulking up aggressively, eating at a massive surplus and lifting heavy, getting his body above 230 pounds. Then the matchup changed. Suddenly, he was fighting Sean Strickland at middleweight, which meant he had to get from somewhere north of 230 all the way down to 185. That's not a weight cut. That's a body transformation on a deadline. And the human body doesn't respond well to that kind of demand. When you try to drop that much mass that quickly, you're not just losing water. Your muscles start breaking down, your recovery collapses, your organs are working under enormous stress, and the whole system starts to buckle. The trash talk between Chimaev and Strickland had already made this one of the most anticipated fights in recent memory. There was real animosity between them, the kind that doesn't feel manufactured for cameras. But the weigh-in turned it into something else entirely. Chimaev arrived with around 20 minutes left in the window, which was already unusual. Champions don't show up last. They want to get it done and move on. And when he walked out, he looked nothing like a fighter who had his weight cut under control. He looked sunken in, exhausted, barely holding himself together. His team described it afterward as the most brutal cut of his career. And you could see every second of it in his face. He stepped on the scale, and the balance bar was still bouncing when officials called 185 and he stepped off. Strickland was standing right there watching it happen and immediately went off, calling him out in front of everyone, accusing him of not making weight, using language that left absolutely no room for interpretation about how he felt. The MMA community jumped on it just as fast. Fighters who had been making weight their entire careers were saying flatly that they knew what a legitimate weigh-in looked like, and that wasn't it. The bar has to balance. The number has to settle. And from where they were standing, neither of those things had happened. The New Jersey Commission signed off anyway. The fight went ahead, and Strickland won by split decision in one of the bigger upsets in recent memory. But the story didn't end there. Chimaev's brother gave an interview afterward that filled in some of the details about what had actually happened in those final hours. He described a situation where the cut had gotten so bad that the team was genuinely debating whether to pull out of the fight entirely. Then he said something that stuck with a lot of people, that the body gave up, that about 200 grams remained, and that they spent the entire night trying to get rid of it and couldn't. And then came the part that nobody missed. Chimaev suffered oxygen deprivation, and his body essentially shut down. His camp never actually said the words, "He didn't make weight," but they didn't need to. When you describe a fighter whose body shut down from oxygen deprivation with weight still left to lose, and then that fighter steps on a scale with a bar that hadn't finished settling, the math isn't complicated. The ambiguity was there, and fans weren't filling it in charitably. What made it even harder to dismiss was that this wasn't the first time Chimaev had been at the center of a suspicious weigh-in. Go back to UFC 267 in Abu Dhabi, October 2021. Chimaev was fighting Li Jingliang, and the setup was almost identical to what would happen years later. He was the last fighter to the scale. On his first attempt, he came in at 171.5, half a pound over the limit, which gave him an extra hour to cut the rest. He came back about 45 minutes later. The scale read 166 pounds, a drop of 5.5 pounds in under an hour. The UFC's own weigh-in coordinator visibly reacted on the broadcast, clearly confused by the number. The fans at home weren't confused at all. The footage showed Chimaev's hands and arms pressing down on the towel that was being held around him. The same technique that had already been used by at least one UFC champion. By shifting just enough body weight onto the people holding the towel, you move the number on the scale without technically touching anything that looks suspicious at a glance. Officials caught it, told him to raise his arms, step off, and go again. The commission later put out a statement attributing the 166 reading to a scale malfunction. On his third attempt, with his arms fully raised and nothing to lean on, he hit 171 when reporters asked him about the footage of his hands on the towel. He smiled and gave them absolutely nothing. He went out the next night and submitted Li Jingliang in just over 3 minutes. Barely took a shot, looked dominant in every way, and that performance made it very easy for a lot of people to stop talking about what happened at the scale because the show was too good to stay angry about the setup. That's how it usually goes. The entertainment value of what happens inside the cage tends to swallow whatever happened outside it, and the sport moves on. That dynamic had already played out in one of the most significant weight-cutting scandals in UFC history. Back at UFC 210 in Buffalo, New York, Daniel Cormier was defending the light heavyweight title against Anthony Johnson, one of the most physically terrifying fighters the division had ever seen. For a title fight, the margin is 0. You hit 205 exactly, or you don't fight for the belt. Cormier stepped on the scale first and came in at 206.2. He looked shocked. Stepped off, disappeared backstage. What happened next took a few minutes. He came back out, stripped down behind a towel held up by members of his team, and stepped back on the scale. The number came up as 205 exactly. Officials approved it. But people watching at home had already seen something. Cormier's hands were resting on top of the towel, pressing down lightly, and that pressure was shifting just enough of his body weight onto the people holding it to drop the number to where he needed it. The officials standing directly beside him didn't catch it. Rumble Johnson's manager filed a formal complaint and called for the title to be vacated. Cormier denied everything, said he was just holding the towel for modesty, and the commission moved forward with the fight. He won by submission in round 2 and kept the belt. Johnson retired immediately after, saying he was done with the sport. For 5 years, Cormier maintained his version of events. Then, in 2022, at his Hall of Fame induction ceremony, with the cameras on him and the crowd in front of him, he said it himself, that he thinks he may have grabbed the towel in Buffalo. He looked directly at Johnson and apologized to him on the microphone, in front of everyone. It was one of the more remarkable moments in recent MMA history, not just because he admitted it, but because of how long it had taken and how much protection the sport had given him in the meantime. He had defended the title, built his legacy, retired on his own terms, and made it all the way to the Hall of Fame before the truth had any kind of public moment at all. The Athletic Commission did update their procedures after that incident, trying to make the process harder to manipulate. And yet 2 years later, someone did almost exactly the same thing under the exact same commission and nearly pulled it off. At UFC 244 at Madison Square Garden, Kelvin Gastelum was fighting Darren Till, a big fight with a lot of attention on it given Till's move up in weight. Gastelum had a well-documented history of struggling to make weight. He had missed at welterweight multiple times, then moved up to middleweight and still couldn't reliably hit the number. which was a striking problem for someone who was actually one of the shorter fighters in the division. He was the last to step on the scale, which was already raising eyebrows. His team had been toweling him down backstage right up until the moment he walked out. He stepped on, and the number read 184, 2 pounds under the limit, clean. Except the footage told a different story. Clearer video showed Gastelum's elbow resting on the shoulder of his coach, Rafael Cordero, who was standing just behind the modesty towel. It's a simple adjustment. Shift a small amount of weight onto someone else, and the scale records less than your actual body weight. The New York State Athletic Commission reviewed the footage the same day and confirmed contact had been made. Gastelum said he hadn't noticed, that he was just trying to keep his hands raised. The fine came out to $1,000. Cordero got $200. For a co-main event fighter making the kind of money Gastelum was pulling, that fine was meaningless. The fight went ahead, and Gastelum lost to Till by split decision. There are fighters at every level of the sport who have risked everything to get an edge on a scale. And for most of them, the consequences have been somewhere between minimal and non-existent. A small fine, a commission statement, a moment of controversy that gets buried under the next week's results. The bigger your name, the more protection the system tends to give you, which makes what happened in Sydney in January 2026 feel like a completely different world. The road to UFC is a tournament where the entire point is to earn a contract. Win the final, and you're on the UFC roster. Aaron Tao had spent years building toward that moment. He had gone 11-1 as a professional, trained at City Kickboxing alongside legitimate world-level fighters, had already come close on Dana White's Contender Series in 2024, and had clawed his way back for a second shot. He was one fight away from everything he had worked toward. Before the weigh-in, he talked about what winning would mean, not just for himself, but for his kids, his family, the people around him. He wasn't treating it like a possibility. He was treating it like something that was already decided. When it came time to weigh in, Tao requested the privacy box, which is exactly what it sounds like. A box that gives fighters a private space to strip down on the scale away from cameras. He stepped in, and the number came up at 122.5 pounds. He was fighting at flyweight, which has a 126-pound limit. A reading that low, that far under the limit, after a fighter who looked completely fine walking in, it didn't add up. The broadcast team watching it happen in real time were already asking questions before officials even reacted. What Tao had done was use the privacy box itself as his leverage point. Instead of leaning on a towel or a coach's shoulder, he had pressed his elbows down on the edges of the box, shifting his weight off the scale in the same fundamental way Cormier and Chimaev had done before him. The difference was that he had overshot it by an enormous margin. Officials caught it, had him step out of the box and weigh in without anything to lean on. The reading came back at 129 pounds, 3 pounds over the limit, and a nearly 7-pound swing from the first number. As one commentator put it, when you cheat a little. You want to come in just barely under. You don't want a 7-pound gap that announces itself to everyone in the room. The fight was canceled immediately. Tao posted an apology the next day, saying he had one job and didn't do it. Within days, the UFC released him. No rescheduled date, no second chance, no fine to pay and move on. Just gone. His opponent eventually got a replacement fight and another crack at a contract. Tao got nothing. After the Contender Series appearance, the road to UFC run, all the regional shows before that, it ended on a scale in Sydney because he leaned too hard on a box and the number came back 7 pounds wrong. That's the reality of this sport when it comes to cheating the scale. If you're a champion defending a belt at a major pay-per-view, there's a good chance you'll be fine. The commission will move forward, the fight will happen, the controversy will fade. If you're a prospect fighting for a contract at a regional final, the same mistake costs you the entire career. The sport has never applied these rules evenly. And that gap between who gets protected and who gets discarded is one of the ugliest things about how MMA actually operates behind the promotion and the highlight reels. The scale is supposed to be the one thing nobody can talk their way around. Turns out, for the right people, it's just another negotiation.